He's a public relations pioneer in China, a man who helped shape the communications industry. He's a trusted advisor with an in-depth understanding and knowledge of East-West perspectives. He's a passionate philanthropist with a long-term vision of advancement for China. Serge Dumont.
Hello and welcome to Up Close. Today I'm with Serge Dumont, who many consider the father of the PR industry in China. Serge, welcome to Up Close. It's a pleasure to have you.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, many people credit you for being the father of PR in China. I'm just curious, how do you view your contribution?
Well, it's certainly an honor to be recognized as someone that helped establish the industry of public relations in China. Along with other peers, I hope that I've helped establish a solid foundation to build an industry on solid ethical foundations with professional background, and that we help attract some of the best people in the industry. What pleases me is that this industry has now grown double-digit for the last few years, and it is now a 30 billion renminbi industry.
It's really accelerated in its growth. Now, you use the word helped, although a lot of people call you the father of the PR industry in China. And truth is, in the 1980s, you started one of the very first PR firms here in China. I have to say that took a lot of foresight, because only in 1979 did China have its very first television advertisement. I mean, this was an industry that virtually was non-existent back then. It must have been very risky. You were a young man from France at that time. What did you see in China that enticed you to say, I'm going to start this firm and it's going to be, related to public relations? How did you have, I guess, this idea?
Well, I guess I was young. I was 25 years old, but I guess risk is really in the DNA of entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs tend to follow their passion, follow market opportunities, and that's pretty much what I did. I mercifully didn't listen to wiser people, because everybody was telling me that there was no market, that it was very risky, that it was actually a hopeless pursuit, and thank God I didn't listen to them.
Right, the older, wiser would say they'd analyze their way out of it, right?
Everybody tried, including my parents, to talk me out of it, and I decided to continue in this endeavor, and I never regretted it. In fact, two things really interested me. One, first, I saw a market opportunity very early on, and the other thing is I discovered a real passion for China and its people.
You said that in 1979.
That's what she reminded me of, and she remembered very well. Now, the thing that really mystified me at that time was the fact that what I discovered in Taiwan and subsequently in mainland China, I went there in the late 70s, was the fact that China and China's culture was so misunderstood, or so, so little known. You're talking about a country that has several thousand years of history, that is, one of the great cultures of the world, and the only civilization, great civilization, that is still, intact, if you wish. And yet, most people knew very little about China. And this is one of the reasons why I felt I have to go deeper into this, learning about this place and learning about the country and its people, and that was the main driver. And at that time, as I said, China was also starting to open up and take off.
Right, it was just starting to open up. And it's no surprise that people didn't know much about China then, because recent history, it had been closed. So there wasn't much communication or transfer happening at that time.
It was.
Yeah, how did you, again, you were hearing that, you had taken this trip to Taiwan, you saw the excitement, the dynamism that was there. So were you just waiting? You're waiting for China to open up.
The words of Emperor Napoleon come to mind. He said, "Let China sleep, because when she wakes, she will shake the world."
Let me fast forward a few to the 80s when you started your first firm. What did you see in the advertising, in the PR industry at that time?
Well, one of the most fascinating facets of China was that it was probably one of the few places on earth where all the brands that we take for granted, that we had grown up with, that were part of our background as Westerners, were virtually unknown in China. So that was really something that struck me immediately. And part of the work that we did as when I established my company in the mid-80s was actually to be involved in the launch of all these brands, very famous, world-famous brands, American brands, European brands. And the first job was obviously to create awareness about these brands.
Sure.
But very often, we had to do much more than that. We actually had to create the whole category. You had to actually, create the category, get people to eat chocolate, for instance.
It was an empty canvas. Can you give me an example, the chocolate example?
People didn't eat chocolate, for instance, and so the challenge was actually to create a category in that, to create the environment that would be conducive to that. We had, in the case of the luxury industry, which, the launch of luxury brands happened a few years later. We had to create an appropriate language. The luxury industry was not considered as, a welcome industry at that time. It was politically incorrect for very understandable reasons. And so you had to find a proper way to explain what luxury was all about. So it was fascinating because it really was very, very deep. It required a lot of thinking. It was not just the early days, as you can imagine, do simple things and then it becomes more complex. In fact, it was, in my view, extremely complex.
In some ways, you're introducing a lifestyle. I mean, I think about chocolate. Chocolate is one of those things that now in China you can buy almost everywhere. I can imagine in the 80s introducing chocolate for the first time. How did you get these foreign brands to understand the Chinese market, and what were some of those challenges?
Well, you had many challenges. I mean, it's the biggest challenges, paradoxically, were actually logistical challenges, and the challenges we found in terms of human resources. Simply said, it was impossible to find office space. My first office was in the Beijing hotel. Then we found this beautiful place in Xuanwu Park, a Chinese-style office. It was not an office. In fact, we turned it into an office with a pond. And it was really interesting, but it was very, very difficult to find anything. The same applies to, telecommunications. It was the days of the telex. You had to book international calls days ahead. I had one of the first mobile phones, and now you actually have 1 billion people with mobile phones in China. So that aspect was actually extremely challenging because
the process around having the business and wasn't actually
it is difficult.
Right.
It is difficult in the sense that you in the service industry, you need to move fast, and all these things made it extremely complicated, but it was interesting. The other challenge was finding the right people. It's a challenge that continues, but for other reasons. When you're establishing one of the first agencies, you actually have no one to follow. You have to follow your own path. And so it meant identifying people that you felt had the right intrinsic qualities, but they didn't have any of the training that was needed to support the brands that we were advising. So it was an extraordinary challenge. It was a lot of fun and very interesting.
Okay. All right. Well, when we come back, we're going to hear more from Serge Dumont, the father of PR in China. Stay tuned. And welcome back to Up Close, where I'm talking with Serge Dumont, considered the father of the PR industry in China. Serge, you established your first PR firm in the 1980s. In 2003, the SARS epidemic became this international health crisis that was really profoundly scrutinized by a lot of international media. It's now become a case study by a lot of Chinese media academics. And what they study is how the Beijing municipal government reacted to the situation, how they handled it, and how the whole history around the media side of handling that situation. I know that you were involved in this, and I'm just wondering how you became involved in the whole SARS media, on the media side of things.
Well, SARS was a crisis of unprecedented magnitude in China. The crisis was already well underway when I got involved. I was approached by the United Nations and by the Beijing municipal government at the time when Wang Qishan became mayor of Beijing, and Vice Premier Wu Yi was put in charge of the management of that situation. Initially, I didn't want to get involved, but after several discussions, I really thought long and hard, and I felt that having been a guest in this country for many years, you know, the city and the country was actually at it was a very difficult situation, and people felt that I could help to some extent. So I decided to help. It was not easy for a number of reasons. I mean, we had to assemble a team, and I invited experts from France, for instance, and they were crisis management experts in the healthcare field. And there was such a level of panic overseas that I even had problems bringing them in. They were the owners of their companies, and their French staff told them, if you go to China, don't bother to come back because we'll all go. And so there was really this incredible level of difficulty that we had to face. This was a crisis, as I said, of an unprecedented magnitude for a number of reasons. The first one was that you had a new virus. This is something that, you know, is bound to create a lot of worries anywhere. In addition, it originated in a country that most people at that time did not understand well, China. Right. So you had actually all the ingredients to make it become a substantial crisis. The other element was that Chinese leaders were not used at that time to communicating. You know, they very rarely, if ever, gave press conferences in those days, and suddenly they were under the glare of the international media, with the whole world worrying and asking questions. So it was an extremely difficult situation where much had to be learned in a very short period of time and in the middle of a crisis, which is probably the worst possible time to do so.
There was tremendous pressure. I mean, they were under a lot of criticism because there was lack of transparency, how they had handled the situation, covered things up. How did you understand why that was happening?
Well, you always need to take a step back. Transparency is the gold standard, but in most crises, it's easier said than done. The reality when you face a crisis is that you seldom have all the elements at your fingertip. So even if you really want to be as transparent as possible, it's very hard to do so. And in the case of a new virus, in the case of SARS, we actually had some of the best brains in the world in that field. I mean, I remember the crisis meeting that I was attending at the WHO. We had, you know, the best people from the US CDC, from the WHO. You were dealing with an entirely unknown virus. So it took time to actually find what we were talking about. And so that in itself, you know, creates tensions and problems because you can't provide the answers.
So lack of information.
Lack of information, and that happens everywhere. If you have a fire in a factory, people expect to have all the answers. Most of them you don't know why it happened until you've actually investigated. But things happen so fast that you need to provide answers. Right. So that was one of the major issues. The other issue that I found interesting, and it was really a watershed in China, is China has had for centuries, perhaps, this tendency of thinking in terms of guoné and guowai, domestic and international. And initially, I guess, this crisis was seen as a domestic issue that could actually be dealt with. The reality, we all know that in this day and age, very few things can be viewed this way, and certainly not health crisis.
So that came to surprise the government in how to deal with it.
Yes, because it required a new way of thinking. What I found interesting is the consequences. In fact, what happened as a result is that a lot of the learnings were institutionalized and applied. For instance, the government instituted a spokespeople system whereby each government organization would actually have spokespeople that would, communicate. And this is the first step towards transparency, the transparency that you are talking about for future crises. So I think it helped establish a more solid foundation to deal with
these issues in the future.
Absolutely.
There's this is a very interesting case example because it was the first time, as you said, that the Beijing municipal government, that China had to learn how to deal with kind of this international media and the concern from the international media around a health crisis. But since then, as China has grown, has accelerated in its economic growth and its growth in its influence throughout the world, a lot of Western countries are still seeing that as a challenge, as a threat. A lot of this is played through the international media. How do you see China's growth?
Well, China's position in the world has changed dramatically over the years and at a speed that is very difficult for many people to understand. So it is inevitable that this will trigger reactions as it happens. People need to adjust. And this is true around the world, but it's actually even true in China. You need an adjustment. One element that people in the West do not necessarily understand is the contributions that China has been making in terms of the West development over its very long history in terms of, technological innovation. A lot of what we call the modern world actually rests on innovations that were made in China. This is something that few people actually understand. The other thing that is not widely understood, people look at China now and say it's an emerging country. In fact, they forget that for most of its history, China was actually the leading country in terms of size and influence. Now, granted, we were in a very different world. It was not a globalized world like we have today. So what we are seeing now is nothing new, but it is happening at such a speed that it is taking a lot of people by surprise, and it requires a lot of adjustment.
All right, well, as China continues to rise, there are issues, and there's been a lot of talk about how to improve its national image. We're going to talk about that when we come back. Stay with us. Welcome back to Up Close, where I'm speaking with Serge Dumont, the father of the PR industry in China. Serge, before the break, we were talking a lot about China and China's national image. How do you feel like China's national image could be improved?
I think it boils down to people, as usual, and direct contacts are the best. People exchanges are the best solution. Cultural, educational exchanges, tourism exchanges. I'm actually very pleased to see that now you have, I work very closely with some of the leading universities in China. There are, African students learning, Asian students, American students learning in China, which is something that didn't happen only, 15 years ago, or very few of them. Now it's actually quite a big number. I was an exception maybe a few years ago, being able to speak Chinese. Now you have all these people who speak perfect Chinese. It's fantastic. You also have tourists. 83 million tourists, or 83 million trips have been made overseas by Chinese tourists. This is extraordinary, and all these people are actually ambassadors, for better or worse, of China in foreign countries. So all these elements allowing direct contacts are a fantastic way to build a relationship. And I always encourage companies to, for instance, have their board meetings in China so that they understand the country better. The other aspect is obviously to do things in a much more institutionalized manner, and you could have image campaigns. One of our agencies, BBDO, just did one for the Philippines. You may have seen it on CNN. It's more fun in the Philippines. It's a great way to actually change the image of a country, but it's part of an overall process.
So which do you feel is more effective? Is it this direct, person-to-person interaction, or is it an advertising campaign?
I think it's an overall. We have elements of soft power that the government can control. There are elements that are, basically rely on you and me and all of us to actually, we know China. People may not know it as well, and we're happy to share our experiences. So it's an overall thing. There are also initiatives that I find very worthwhile. For instance, what Steven Schwartzman is doing at Tsinghua University, where he's raised $300 million to provide scholarships, and he plans to train 10,000 students in within the next 50 years. These kind of initiatives are really what I call enlightened philanthropy, because it really contributes to building long-term bonds between, in this case, the U.S. and China. So I think this is fantastic. So it's a multitude of things that have to be done.
And just like the other aspects of China, it seems like these sorts of exchanges are increasing by the day, by the month. You hear about more and more every year that passes by.
Absolutely.
This year, there was a term that was coined by President Xi Jinping, and he called it the Chinese dream. You've been here you've worked here for over 30 years. How do you understand what this Chinese dream is?
Well, I think the Chinese dream is a beautiful concept that is very aspirational, and it can mean many things to many people. To me, it reflects the renewed pride and sense of optimism that Chinese people feel vis-à-vis their culture, and the sense of optimism towards the future. China as a country has had a very turbulent history, especially over the last few hundred years, and it's heartening to know that Chinese people can look forward to a happier, more stable, more prosperous future in the 21st century. So, and perhaps the other thing that I might add on this, being an entrepreneur myself, is that any entrepreneur has to be a dreamer as well. There is a part of dream in entrepreneurship. So this concept even applies to entrepreneurship, in my view.
Sure. And what's your dream? What's your Chinese dream?
Well, I guess I may already have achieved part of my Chinese dream, having come to this country, almost 30 years ago, and having done what, I wanted to do. So it's been an interesting dream.
You talked about philanthropy earlier, and I know that you're very involved in many causes as well. What are the causes that you are the most passionate about?
Well, education is, without any doubt, the most important issue. Everything starts with education. Educating the workforce for a company is the only way to build a sustainable future. Educating a workforce and young people, the next generation, for a country is how you build a sustainable and happy future for the country. So education, to me, is the most important thing. And this is why, from a professional standpoint, I'm very happy I joined Omnicom, a company that actually believes passionately in that. On a personal level, I set up a foundation that sends young people that study in the communications department of Tsinghua and Fudan for internships at the United Nations in Geneva and Bangkok. And it really pleases me when I hear them talk about their experience and how this has impacted their lives and how it changed their outlook.
What are you hoping they get out of that experience?
Well, it's a unique experience. It's something that really money can't buy, because it's really like one of these experiences that open your eyes. And so what I hope they understand, in this case it is with UN AIDS, and so you're exposing people that had absolutely no idea about AIDS that may end up working, and they are from the elite universities, so they may end up working in banks or in the media or elsewhere, and they have no reason to get involved with this issue, which is a complex issue, and they suddenly understand it. So it will, one way or another, hopefully have an impact. I'm also very involved in, I sit on the board of the China Youth Development Foundation, and one of the things that I love about this organization, it's one of the largest charity organizations in China, is that it builds schools all around China and in Africa, in fact, and it really literally changes the lives of people that otherwise would not have had access to education and to a future. So to me, this is really great. The other area where, and this one actually, education plays an absolutely critical role that I got involved with, is the fight against AIDS. The fight against AIDS is actually all about education. It's education to help people in terms of prevention, people from getting, getting the disease, but also education to change behaviors, to protect people that have the disease and to prevent them from being affected by discrimination and stigma. This is where I realized that, in fact, we all have the power to make a difference. But when it comes to our industry, which is really all about communicating and influence, you actually have the power to use your trade to make the world a better place.
Thank you so much, Serge. It's really been a pleasure to have you here on Up Close.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And thank you to our viewers at home for tuning in. We'll see you next weekend on Up Close. Bye for now.